polished scatterplot with menus. This scatterplot with menus is frankly hideous. While it does work, the styling on these menus is, well, let's just say there's room for improvement. I'll start by forking this example, and then I'll set my intention by changing the title to Polished Scatterplot with Menus. This piece needs some polish. We could polish the appearance of these menus. When you start looking for off-the-shelf solutions for ReactDropdown menu, you come across a bunch of solutions. The Bootstrap solution, which in my opinion is very heavy, it includes a lot of stuff that you don't need. And Semantic UI is another one of those. I was struck by ReactDropdown. This package looks pretty popular at 65,000 downloads a week. It claims to be simple, and it also claims to address the problem that the default HTML select element is hard to style. It's inspired by React Select. React Select is apparently like the granddaddy select component. It's got 17,900 stars and seems to do everything under the sun. You can type into these, you can have multiple elements, but this seems to do more than what we need. Let's take a look at the ReactDropdown demo. It's a pretty humble page that shows you this very nice looking drop-down menu. ReactDropdown only has 446 stars, but it's used by, 3,000 packages. This is the process of evaluating third-party libraries to use. You want to look at things like how many stars does it have? How many downloads per week does it have? How recently was it updated? Is it active? As third-party libraries go, this ReactDropdown library looks usable to me, since all we need to do is replace our very simple use case for the select element with something that just looks better. So let's give ReactDropdown a try. Let's see if we can get a browser build of this library by going to unpackage.com/ReactDropdown. This looks like a common JS build because it uses require, which unfortunately we can't use in the browser. It turns out there is no browser build for ReactDropdown, so I made a fork of this library that does have a browser build. It's called ReactDropdown Browser. If we have a look at this package, you can see that in fact it does have a browser build. UMD means Universal Module Definition. UMD is a way of structuring modules or JavaScript files such that they can be consumed by different environments, including CommonJS, AMD, which is less popular nowadays. AMD stands for Asynchronous Module Definition, and also browser globals, and this is the one that we use. When you use a script tag that loads in a UMD file, it introduces a global variable that you can then use in your code. So that's what we're going to do here, just like we've been doing for React and D3. I'm going to use the minified build, weighing around 7 kilobytes, by going to this file and clicking View Raw to get this URL here that I'll copy, and then over in index.html, with our other script tags, I'll introduce another script tag where the source is that URL. Now in index.js, we can import ReactDropdown from React-Dropdown. And then let's just check if that was defined by saying console.log ReactDropdown. It prints out a function. So it looks like it is, in fact, getting defined. This name resolution may seem a bit magical, and it is one of the sort of magical elements of Vizhub. The way that it works right now is that there's this library called Vizhub-libraries that tells the Vizhub rollup configuration how to resolve package names to global variables. For example, D3 resolves to D3, React resolves to React, and react-dropdown resolves to react-dropdown. This is why we can import from the package called react-dropdown, and it will work. But anyway, now that we've got this react-dropdown imported, we should be able to just use it in place of our existing dropdown component by just changing dropdown to react-dropdown. It sort of worked. It looks like we're missing some CSS. It turns out this package also provides some CSS. This is what gives the menu its pleasant appearance. Again, we can go view raw, copy this URL, and then in our index.html, we can make a new link tag where the href goes to that URL. Now we get a nicely styled drop-down menu. See that? All right, we've got this third-party library to make drop-down menus for us. Now we just need to sort of smooth everything over and make everything look perfect. The first thing I notice is that this goes all the way across. Let's see what the DOM structure is so that we can style it with CSS. It looks like everything's inside of this drop-down root div. Let's see if we can style that div with some CSS by saying dot dropdown dash root. And let's see, can I set the width of this to be, say, 100 pixels? All right, that works. Okay, we've set the width to 100. That seems a bit small. 300 seems pretty nice. That looks reasonable. I would like it to flow to the right, though, instead of flowing down. I think the reason why it's flowing down is because it's set to be display block, as all divs are. We can address that by setting the display to inline block. Now it flows to the right like a span or a label or a native select element. All right, now I think we're ready to also apply it to the Y menu over in index.js. Here it is. We can just change dropdown to be react-dropdown, and we get the same thing here. All right, so it's not actually getting the update events, and it's also not setting the initial value. Let's see what the react-dropdown documentation can tell us. Here's some example usage code. They use the onChange prop. Let's try to get that part working. Instead of selected value change, it should just be onChange. Let's see, does that work now? It does, but it looks like it's not getting the right data structure. Let's see, what gets passed into this function? I'm assuming it's going to be some kind of event object, and let me just console.log event just to see what we're dealing with. Let's see, what will come out in the console? Okay, we get an object that has value and label. All right, that's great information. In that case, I think this should be called option because it's essentially an entry in our options array. And here we can invoke set y attribute with option.value. Now let's see, does this update? Yes, it does. All right, that seems to be working. We could clean this up a bit more by using destructuring. So I'll get rid of that option dot, and then we can destructure that option to unpack value from it, like this. Now this should still be working. All right, sweet. Let's give the same treatment to our X dropdown. I'll paste that logic there, and instead of setting Y attribute, we can set X attribute. And I'll get rid of that old logic that doesn't work. Now setting X should work. All right, it does. Now that we're using this third-party library, the ID doesn't really make sense. It's not accepted as an argument. It's not used. So I'm just going to delete those. We can also delete this for on our label. And, it doesn't need to be a label at all. And one thing I noticed with the label is that we lose the font that should be getting applied to the entire body element. So I think if we change label to span, we might get those styles back. All right, X changed to be quite small. Here's what I'll do. I'll give it a class name of dropdown-label, just so we can style it with CSS. And I'll do the same for the Y dropdown label. I'll change X to Y right there. Now that we've got those in place, let's work on their appearance in the CSS. I'm just going to add to the end of our CSS here. We can select on dot dropdown-label. And this CSS for the select is no longer relevant because we're not using those elements anymore. But I think I'd like to use that same font size of 3EM. Okay, great. That's looking better. It would be cool if these X and Y shared the same size and color as these axis labels. Let's see, what are those sizes and colors? Here it is, axis label. What if we just apply this same style to our dropdown label? We can add a comma like that to make it happen, and then we can get rid of this other CSS for dropdown label. Oops, I forgot the dot. So dot dropdown label. Okay, we got the size. We did not get the color. That's because fill is an SVG specific thing. And if it's a div or a span, you have to set color. All right, now they've got the same color. I would like to make these drop-down menus themselves a bit bigger. Let's see how it goes if we set the font size on the drop-down root element. That looks a bit too big. How about 1.5 EM? All right, so if we open up these, it seems like there's a limit being set, and then within that limit you can scroll. I guess that's fine, but I wonder, can that be addressed? Let's take a look in the DOM. Inside of this drop-down menu, here we've got some CSS that says max height is 200 pixels. So, we could just override that by adding some new CSS where we select on dot drop-down menu, and then we can set the max height to be, let's say, 500 pixels. Now, there's no limit, and we see all of the entries. That's great. Maybe let's keep some limit, like, 400 pixels, in case it does go off the screen. All right, the next thing I see is that it's not getting our initial value. It's saying select right here. That's because it expects something called value as the prop, which is the default option. Over in our index.js, when we invoke that drop-down component, we're setting selected value, but what if we just set value here? All right, that works. See, we're getting petal length as the value. And then as we change it, it behaves correctly. All right, sweet. We can do the same for our Y menu. Just change selected value to value. All right, that's looking pretty good. This is pretty close to what I'm after here, but I would like these to just be centered. Everything should be centered horizontally and also vertically. Like, I don't like that this is much higher than this text here, and maybe we could add some space also. Let's give that a try. To center things horizontally, it would be convenient if all of this stuff were in some kind of a parent containing element. I'll set up a div and give it a class name of menus container, and that will contain the X and the Y menus, but not the SVG. So before that SVG element, I'll close up that div. Now let's see if we can use some CSS to style this and put it in the center. Over in our index.html, in our CSS, we can select on .menus container. The tool that I reach for with this sort of work is Flexbox. We can say display is flex. Okay, now we're entering a whole new world of Flexbox. It's awesome. If you Google Flexbox, you'll find this a complete guide to Flexbox. This is my go-to resource that explains all about Flexbox. You enter this world with display flex, and then you can do all sorts of things like change the direction that things flow in, set how things grow proportionate to their siblings, and you can also center things, and this is what we're going to use. We can set justify content to be center, and hopefully things will be centered. So for our menus container, let's just set justify content to be center. All right, look at that. Things are centered. That's exactly what I wanted it to do. With Flexbox, there's another thing called align items, which is sort of the perpendicular thing to justify content. It will align things vertically. So let's try setting align items to be center as well. For our menus container, align items, center, and now that addressed the vertical centering problem. See how now things are much more smoothly vertically centered? If I remove that line, you can see that the menus are slightly higher than the text, and this looks a bit better. Lastly, I'd like to introduce some space around these labels. We can do that just by styling our drop-down label. I'll start another block because we just want this stuff to apply to the drop-down label and not the axis label. Let's try setting the margin. Let's set the left margin with margin-left, and let's say 10 pixels. All right, that added some space to the left of our Y right there. We could even go for more, maybe 50 pixels. That doesn't look too bad. And now let's add some space to the right by setting margin right. 50 is a bit too much for that, maybe 5. That looks pretty good. Now I'm questioning whether we even need that colon. I think we can express the association better with just proximity. So I think I'll get rid of that colon. There it is. Drop-down label is X colon. So I'll just get rid of that colon there. I'll get rid of the colon for the Y as well. All right, that's looking pretty good. We can just try to balance the white space just a bit more with our CSS. I think we could use even more space in between X and Y. And we could use some space even on the top. Maybe just a little bit, like 10 pixels. Or 20 pixels. Or, wait a minute, this is not the right place to add them. I want everything to move down a little bit. For that, we should apply it to our container, our menus container. There we go. And since this contains everything, I just feel like it should be on the top of all this. And now the white space is pretty much even between the top and the bottom, but there's more white space on the left. So we can give our container some right margin. All right, now it feels a bit more balanced. The labels feel a bit close to the menus. I'll just increase the right margin just a little bit. All right, that's looking not too bad. Looking pretty good. This G is getting a little, almost cut off, so I'll just change menu height to be a few more pixels, maybe 79, or how about 82. All right, now it's well within the margin there. All right, that's how you can really polish up your scatterplot with menus by using a third-party library and just finessing the heck out of it by tweaking the CSS until it looks perfect to you. And using Flexbox, which is the most amazing thing ever. That's all for polished scatterplot with menus.